Part 1. Betrayal in the Rain. The rain falling on Oakhaven Cemetery felt like ice, but it was nothing compared to the chill radiating from Grayson Ashworth. 72-year-old Cordelia Ashworth stood a few paces away from the freshly dug grave of her late husband Silas, her fragile frame wrapped in a black wool coat that had seen better decades. Her hands, weathered and gentle, trembled inside their thin leather gloves. The cold Vermont wind whipped through the mourners, catching the edges of umbrellas and rattling the bare branches of the old oaks that lined the cemetery paths. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out harsh and lonely. For 22 years, Cordelia had been the heart of the Ashworth home. She had loved Silas deeply with the kind of quiet, unwavering devotion that only comes to those who find love later in life when they have stopped expecting it. She had nursed him through his final agonizing battle with dementia, spoon-feeding him broth when he could no longer hold a bowl, reading him passages from his favorite Steinbeck novels when he could no longer follow the words on a page, holding his hand through the long, terrifying nights when he did not recognize her at all. She had also helped raise Grayson from the time he was 10 years old, trying desperately to be a mother to a boy whose heart had seemingly been carved from Vermont granite. Grayson did not look at her during the service. Dressed in a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than most people in Oakhaven made in a month, he stared at his father's mahogany casket with a dry, calculating gaze. There were no tears from the 32-year-old heir. There was only the barely concealed impatience of a man waiting to claim what he believed was rightfully his throne. 2 days later, the true depth of Grayson's cruelty was unveiled inside the sterile wood-paneled office of Ezekiel Thorne, the Ashworth family's longtime estate attorney. The office smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco, and heavy oil paintings of hunting scenes lined the walls. Cordelia sat in a high-backed leather chair, her hands clutching her worn purse in her lap. Beside her, Grayson lounged with an air of absolute arrogance, checking his gold wristwatch every few minutes. "Let's get this over with, Ezekiel," Grayson snapped, not bothering to hide his disdain. "I have a board meeting at Ashworth Manufacturing in Burlington in an hour. It's time the company had real leadership." Mr. Thorne cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He was a thin man in his 60s with hollow cheeks and eyes that never quite met anyone directly. He looked down at the last will and testament of Silas Ashworth, a document that had been mysteriously updated only 3 weeks before Silas's massive fatal stroke. During those final weeks, Silas's mind had been slipping badly, and Grayson had taken over his father's medical and legal affairs with sudden aggressive efficiency. "Very well," Mr. Thorne said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "To my son Grayson Ashworth, I leave the entirety of my shares in Ashworth Manufacturing, the primary estate located on Oak Grove Lane, and all liquid assets held in my personal and business accounts." Cordelia's breath hitched. That was everything. The multi-million-dollar company Silas had built from nothing over 4 decades. The ancestral home she had restored with her own hands over 22 years, sanding the old oak floors, refinishing the crown molding, choosing every curtain and rug. The savings they had shared, the retirement accounts. The trust that was supposed to protect her old age. "And to my wife Cordelia," the attorney continued, refusing to meet her eyes, "I leave the deed to Tract 42, commonly known as the Miller's Folly acreage, to do with as she sees fit." Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Cordelia stared at the attorney, her mind racing. "Tract 42, she whispered. "Ezekiel, that's just the old barren field out past the county line. It's 12 acres of rocks and dead soil. Silas bought it 30 years ago as a tax write-off. There's nothing there but an abandoned hunting cabin that's falling down. That is what the document states, Mrs. Ashworth." Thorne replied stiffly, sliding the paperwork toward her without looking up. But Silas promised. Cordelia said, her voice finally breaking. He promised I would have the house. He promised I would be taken care of. He was barely lucid when this was signed. Are you accusing me of something, Cordelia? Grayson sneered, dragging out her name like a curse. He leaned forward, dropping the facade of the grieving son entirely. His handsome young face twisted into an expression she had glimpsed only rarely over the years, and always with a chill. My father finally saw reason at the end. You were nothing but a gold digger who swooped in when my mother was barely cold in her grave. You spent 20 years living in luxury on the Ashworth dime. Now the ride is over. I raised you, Grayson, she whispered, tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. I loved your father, and I tried to love you. Save the soap opera for someone who cares. Grayson laughed, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket with a sharp, satisfied motion. The will is ironclad. My lawyers made sure of it. You have exactly 2 hours to get your personal belongings out of my house. If you're not gone by noon, I'll have security drag you out. Cordelia felt the world tilt on its axis. She was 72 years old, suffering from arthritis in her hands and hips, and had just buried the love of her life. Now she was being thrown into the street by the boy she had tucked into bed on countless nights. The boy whose scraped knees she had bandaged, the boy she had held through his own mother's funeral so long ago. She looked at Ezekiel Thorne, but the attorney was studying his desk blotter as though it contained the answer to a puzzle he could not solve. She rose slowly, gathered her purse, and walked out of the office without another word. When Cordelia arrived back at the Oak Grove mansion, Grayson had already moved with ruthless efficiency. 2 burly private security guards stood on the grand wraparound porch. On the driveway, sitting in the freezing October drizzle, were 3 black heavy-duty trash bags. What is this? Cordelia gasped, stepping out of her beat-up 1998 Volvo station wagon. Mr. Ashworth's orders, one of the guards said, crossing his thick arms. He had the maids pack your clothes. You are no longer permitted on the premises. My photo albums? Cordelia cried, trying to push past the guard. Silas's letters, my mother's china, my wedding dress. The guard shoved her back hard enough that she stumbled and fell onto the wet, unyielding concrete of the driveway. Pain shot through her hip, sharp and blinding. But the physical ache was drowned out by the agonizing heartbreak of the moment. She looked up at the towering windows of the master bedroom, the room where she had slept beside Silas for 22 years. The room where she had held his hand through the last long night. There, standing behind the glass, was Grayson. He looked down at her, shivering in the rain, raised a crystal glass of scotch in a mocking toast, and let the heavy velvet curtains fall shut. Shivering, soaked to the bone, and entirely alone in the world, Cordelia picked herself up. Her hip throbbed. Her hands bled from where they had scraped the concrete. She loaded the 3 trash bags into the back of her old Volvo. She had no money except the small emergency fund in her purse. She had no family since her parents were long dead, and she had never had children of her own. She had nowhere to go. Nowhere except Tractor 42, the barren wasteland that was now her entire worldly inheritance. The drive to Tract 42 took nearly an hour, winding deep into the neglected rural outskirts of Oak Haven County. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to rutted, muddy dirt trails. When Cordelia finally pulled her sputtering Volvo to a halt, the reality of her situation settled heavily upon her chest. Before her lay 12 acres of absolute desolation. The locals had not called it Miller's Folly for nothing. The land was a jagged expanse of limestone, dead weeds, and gray, unyielding dirt. No crops could grow here. No developer would ever build here. The land seemed to have refused every effort at civilization for over a century. In the center of the wasteland sat a dilapidated wooden structure that barely qualified as a cabin. The roof sagged in the middle, the porch steps had rotted through, and the windows were caked with decades of grime. Cordelia stepped out of the car, the biting Vermont wind whipping her silver hair around her face. She walked up to the cabin, broke the rusted padlock with a heavy stone from the ground, and pushed the door open. The smell of mildew, animal droppings, and stagnant air washed over her. There was no electricity, no running water. Only a crude wood-burning stove in the corner and a rusty iron bed frame. She sank onto the dusty floor, buried her face in her hands, and finally let out the agonizing, guttural sobs she had been holding back for hours. She wept for Silas. She wept for the betrayal of the boy she had tried to mother. And she wept for herself, an old woman left to die in the dirt. But Cordelia Ashworth was not a woman who surrendered easily. She had grown up poor in the mill towns of central Vermont before meeting Silas, working as a bookkeeper by day and helping her mother take in laundry by night. Beneath her gentle exterior was a spine of pure steel. As the evening shadows lengthened, she wiped her tears and forced herself to breathe. "Crying won't keep you warm, Cordy," she muttered to herself, using the nickname Silas had always called her. That night, she slept in the Volvo with all 3 trash bags piled around her for warmth. Her hip ached and her hand stung, but she slept. The next morning, she woke to the sound of a diesel engine coming up the rutted track. A weathered green tractor pulled to a stop at the edge of her field, and an elderly man in a heavy canvas coat and a brown wool hat climbed down. He walked slowly across the frost-dusted ground, his breath forming clouds in the cold October air. "Mom," he called out as he approached the cabin. "I saw the smoke last night from your car. I thought maybe someone was in trouble." Cordelia stepped out onto the sagging porch, wrapping her wool coat tighter around herself. The man stopped at what he judged to be a respectful distance and removed his brown hat, revealing a head of thick white hair. "Clement Hargrove, ma'am. I own the farm on the east side of your property line, about a mile down the track." His voice was rough and slow, the accent of a lifelong Vermonter. "You planning on staying out here?" "For now, yes," Cordelia said quietly. "My name is Cordelia Ashworth." Something flickered in Clement Hargrove's gray eyes at the name. He was 70 years old, a widower for the past 5, retired from 38 years as a mining engineer at the granite quarries down in Barren. Since his wife Ruth had died of ovarian cancer, he had turned to farming to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. He had lost his only son Michael 15 years earlier, when the boy's logging truck went off a bad grade in a February storm in the White Mountains. Clement Hargrove knew grief the way other men knew their own reflections. "Ashworth," he repeated slowly. "Silas Ashworth's widow, then?" "Yes. I read about your husband's passing in the paper. My condolences." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove." "Clement, please." He looked past her at the sagging cabin. "That building's not fit for winter. You know that." "I know. You have family you can go to." "No." He nodded slowly, as though this was information he had expected. Then he put his hat back on and turned toward his tractor. "I'll be back in a couple of hours," he said over his shoulder. "Mr. Hargrove, you don't have to." "Clement," he said again without turning around. He came back with a cord of dry firewood in the trailer behind his tractor, along with a kerosene heater, a wool blanket that had belonged to his wife, a large cast-iron pot of beef stew still warm from his stove, and a battered but functional oil lantern. He unloaded everything onto the porch without asking permission, showed her how to light the wood stove and the kerosene heater safely, and told her she was welcome to draw water from his well anytime she needed it, since the creek would freeze solid by December. "You are being very kind, Clement," Cordelia said as he prepared to leave. He paused at the top of the porch steps, considering her with those slow gray eyes. "My wife would have skinned me alive if I'd left a widow to freeze in a cabin like this, Mrs. Ashworth," he said. "This isn't kindness. This is just what a decent man does." Then he touched the brim of his hat and drove his tractor slowly back down the muddy track toward his own farm. He offered again the next week to let her stay in his spare bedroom until she could sort out her affairs. She refused politely, but firmly. "This is Silas's land, Clement," she told him. "I'm not going anywhere." He accepted her decision without argument, but he returned every few days with supplies, canned goods from his pantry, more firewood, a pair of thick wool socks that had belonged to his son Michael and had never been worn. She protested about the socks, but he shook his head. "They've been sitting in a drawer for 15 years, Mrs. Ashworth. Michael would have wanted them on a pair of feet that needed them. She wore them every night after that, and she thought of a boy she had never met dying too young on a mountain road, and of a father who kept his son's socks in a drawer for 15 years because he could not bring himself to throw them away." She understood Clement Hargrove better after that. November came, and with it the first snows. Cordelia settled into a rhythm she would not have believed herself capable of a month earlier. She rose before dawn to feed the wood stove. She hauled water from the creek, then from Clement's well when the creek froze. She chopped kindling with a small hatchet Clement had loaned her, working slowly to protect her arthritic shoulders. She ate simply canned beans and rice and whatever soup Clement dropped off. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, and her silver hair grew longer and wilder, but her eyes stayed clear. In the long silent evenings by the light of the oil lantern, she looked at the few keepsakes the maids had hastily thrown into the trash bags. There were not many. A worn leather-bound Bible, a photograph of her mother from the 1950s, a cheap plastic comb, and an ornate silver locket that Silas had given her on their 10th anniversary. It was an unusual piece of jewelry, thick and clunky, locked with a tiny clasp that had always seemed a bit stiff. Sitting by the fire one bitter December night, Cordelia held the locket in her palm and remembered Silas's final days in the hospital. After his stroke, he had lost the ability to speak, but she vividly recalled him lying in that hospital bed, frantically tapping his chest, where the locket used to rest against her collarbone. He would tap his own chest, then point a trembling, desperate finger toward the framed map of Oakhaven County that hung on the wall opposite his bed. Specifically, he pointed to the outskirts to Tract 42. She had thought at the time that his mind was wandering, that he was trying to say something about the locket, or about the land, or about a memory only he could see. She had never connected the two. Why, she wondered now, tracing the cool silver of the locket with her fingertip. Silas had been a brilliant businessman, sharp with numbers and shrewd with investments, right up until the disease took his mind. Why had he kept this useless barren plot of land for 30 years, paying taxes on it annually, without ever visiting it once he had never hunted? He had never fished the small dead creek that ran along its edge. He had never so much as driven her out to see it. She fell asleep that night with the locket clutched in her hand. Twist number 2. The following morning, sorting through the third trash bag more carefully than she had before, Cordelia's fingers found something hard tucked between the folds of an old winter sweater. She pulled it out. It was a small leather-bound journal, no larger than her palm, its cover soft with age. She did not recognize it, and yet the moment she opened the cover, she knew it was Silas's handwriting on the inside page. His nurses at Oak Grove had let him keep a small notebook in his last months. She had thought the maids had thrown it away, or that Grayson had confiscated it. But someone, perhaps one of the housekeepers who had loved her, had slipped it into the bag among her clothes. Most of the pages were blank. Some contained wandering, disconnected notes from the depths of his dementia phrases she could not decipher. But near the middle of the journal, written in a shaky but deliberate hand, were 4 sentences that stopped her heart. Cordy, my darling, if you are reading these words, then trust in the key of our love. Dig where I have shown you. The truth is beneath the ugliest dirt. I have loved you always. Cordelia read the words a dozen times. She read them until the letters blurred with tears. Then she stood up in the dim cabin, walked to the door, and looked out across the frozen wasteland of Tract 42 glittering under a pale winter sun. Somewhere out there, beneath 12 acres of rocks and dead soil, Silas had left her a message, and the key of their love was hanging around her neck. The rest of December passed slowly, and January was worse. A blizzard buried the cabin in 3 feet of snow, and for 4 days Cordelia could not leave the porch. Clement plowed the road to her cabin twice a week with his tractor, and brought her boiling pots of soup that she stretched into 3 days of meals. February brought a cold snap so severe that the water in her metal cup froze overnight beside the wood stove. Her arthritis flared until she could barely close her hands in the mornings, and she had to warm her fingers over the stove for 20 minutes before she could grip anything. Through all of it, she thought about the journal. She thought about the locket. She thought about Silas tapping his chest in that hospital bed. She waited because she had no choice for the ground to soften enough to let her dig. March came in like a lion. The wind tore across the field and one of the porch supports finally gave way. Clement came over and repaired it with lumber from his own barn, refusing payment. "Consider it rent," he told her, "for letting me be useful." She realized watching him hammer nails into the fresh planks that she had come to depend on this quiet man in a way she had not depended on anyone since Silas. She was grateful for him, and she said so. He paused, wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his weathered hand, and looked at her with those slow gray eyes. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "I am grateful for you too. Winters are long when you live alone." He went back to his hammering, and neither of them said anything more about it. By the first week of April, the great mountains of snow began to shrink at last. The creek ran high with meltwater. The earth of Tract 42 began to emerge from its long white sleep, muddy and hard and unwelcoming. Cordelia walked out into her field one bright, cold morning with a heavy iron pickaxe borrowed from Clement's barn, a small hand shovel in a canvas sack, and Silas's silver locket resting against her heart. She stood in the center of the 12 barren acres, turning slowly, feeling the wind on her face. Then she walked to a subtle depression in the earth near a dead cedar tree, a low spot that was usually hidden by tall thistles in the summer. Silas had described it in his journal in a single sentence buried among his other notes. "East of the cabin where the shadow of the dead cedar falls at midday." The shadow of the dead cedar fell exactly on the depression at noon. Cordelia planted her worn boots, raised the pickaxe high above her head, and swung it down into the frozen earth. The blow rang out across the empty field, echoing off the distant tree line. Pain shot up her arthritic shoulders. She staggered, gripped the handle tighter, and swung again. The barren field, which had guarded its secret for 30 years, was finally about to give it up. Part 2: Discovery and Trials. The first week of April brought a fragile, hesitant thaw to the Vermont countryside. The great mountains of snow that had buried Tract 42 for 5 brutal months began to shrink, revealing patches of muddy earth beneath. The creek that had frozen solid in January now ran swift and cold, swollen with meltwater. And Cordelia Ashworth, 72 years old and lean as a birch sapling, after a winter of canned beans and hard labor, stood in the middle of her barren field with a pickaxe in her weathered hands and a purpose burning quietly in her chest. She had not slept the night she discovered Silas's hidden journal. She had lain on the rusted iron bed frame, the small leather-bound book pressed against her heart, reading his trembling words over and over by the flickering light of the kerosene lantern. Cordy, my darling, if you are reading these words, then trust in the key of our love. Dig where I have shown you. She understood now. She understood everything. The silver locket. The way Silas had tapped his chest so desperately in that hospital bed. The way his trembling finger had pointed at the framed map of Oak Haven County at the outskirts at Tract 42. He had been trying to tell her. Even as dementia stole his words and his memories, he had fought to leave her this message. And she, blinded by grief and the cruelty of Grayson, had almost missed it entirely. Now, standing in the pale April sunlight, Cordelia knew what she had to do, and she knew she had to do it alone. Clement Hargrove would have insisted on helping. He would have brought his tractor, his shovels, his strong 70-year-old back that had been forged by decades of granite mining down in Barren. He would have made it easier. But Cordelia understood in a way that only widows of long marriages could understand, that this was not a task to be made easier. This was between her and Silas. This was the last conversation they would ever have, and no one else could be part of it. The ground near the subtle depression Silas had described was still half frozen, the surface hard as stone. Cordelia raised the heavy iron pickaxe, planted her boots in the mud, and swung. The first blow rang out across the barren field, a dull thud against unyielding earth. A shock of pain ran up her arthritic shoulders, radiating down her spine. She gasped, staggered, and nearly dropped the tool, but she planted her feet again and swung a second time, and a third, and a fourth. By noon, she had cleared only a small patch, perhaps 3 feet by 3 feet. Her hands, protected by only a pair of thin gardening gloves, were bleeding through the fabric. Her back screamed with every movement. She sat down on a limestone rock and drank cold creek water from a mason jar, staring at the shallow hole she had made. 12 acres, she thought, and almost laughed at the impossibility of it. But then she looked at the silver locket resting against her chest, and she remembered Silas's finger pointing at the map, and she picked up the pickaxe again. The second day was worse. Her muscles had seized overnight, and every swing sent lightning through her joints. She wept openly as she worked, not from despair, but from a strange, fierce joy. She was doing this for him. She was answering his last message. Clement Hargrove drove by around midday in his old Ford pickup, slowing as he passed the field. He saw her out there digging, and he pulled over. He climbed out of the truck and walked to the edge of the field with his weathered brown hat in his hands. "Mrs. Ashworth," he called across the mud, "you need a hand." Cordelia straightened, wiped sweat and dirt from her forehead with the back of her wrist, and shook her head. "No, Clement, not with this, but thank you." He studied her for a long moment. This fragile widow with her silver hair weeping in the April wind, her hands bleeding through her gloves, her eyes bright with a purpose he did not understand, but respected completely. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and returned to his truck. He did not ask what she was digging for. He simply drove home and made her a pot of beef stew, which he left in a covered pot on her cabin porch that evening. On the third day, Cordelia's pickaxe found something that was not earth. She had been swinging in a steady, exhausted rhythm, no longer thinking, no longer feeling anything except the dull ache of her body. Then the pickaxe struck, and instead of the familiar thud of soil or the sharp crack of limestone, there came a loud ringing metallic clang. The vibration was so intense it knocked the tool from her raw, bleeding hands and sent her staggering backward. Cordelia froze. For a long moment she stood in the muddy field, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs like a war drum. Then she dropped to her knees in the wet earth and began scraping away the soil with her bare hands. Her nails, already cracked and torn from 3 days of labor, tore further. She did not notice. 10 inches beneath the surface, she uncovered it. It was not a pipe. It was not an old tractor part. It was a massive, perfectly square plate of heavy reinforced steel, roughly 4 feet by 4 feet, set into the earth, like the door to another world. In the center was a thick circular wheel, heavily oxidized but intact. And in the exact center of that wheel was a distinct, unusually deep keyhole with an antique mechanism far too complex for any ordinary bunker. Cordelia sat back in the mud, her mind reeling. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached beneath her collar and pulled out the heavy silver locket that Silas had given her on their 10th anniversary. She had always thought the interior contained a decorative piece of molded silver fused to the frame. But now, with the memory of his desperate tapping at his chest burning in her mind, she pried at the interior piece with her dirt-caked thumb. It clicked and slid free. It was not decoration. It was an intricately cut steel key. Cordelia crawled back to the hatch on her hands and knees. She blew the decades of dust and debris out of the keyhole. Then, taking a deep, shuddering breath, she inserted the key. It fit perfectly. She turned it with a hard twist of her wrist, and a loud mechanical thunk resonated from deep beneath the earth, so profound it seemed to shake the very bones of the field. The barren wasteland had just unlocked its secret. Cordelia sat back in the mud and began to laugh. It was not the laugh of a sane woman. It was the laugh of a 72-year-old widow who had been thrown into the freezing rain with garbage bags, who had survived a Vermont winter alone in a rotting cabin, who had bled and wept and dug for 3 days on a message from her dead husband, and who now understood that Silas had loved her more than she had ever dared to believe. She did not open the hatch immediately. She sat in the mud, staring at the steel plate, letting herself feel the enormity of what was about to happen. And then, slowly, with the last of her strength, she gripped the rusted wheel with both hands and pulled. The wheel resisted at first, decades of neglect welding it in place. But Cordelia planted her boots against the cold steel plate and threw her weight backward with a guttural cry that tore from her throat. With a screech of metal against metal, the wheel turned a full quarter rotation. A hiss of stale compressed air escaped from the seal, and the heavy steel hatch, counterweighted by concealed industrial hinges, suddenly popped upward. Cordelia scrambled back as the hatch swung open, revealing a gaping rectangular black hole in the earth. The smell that wafted up was not decay, but the dry, clean scent of poured concrete and machine oil. A set of sturdy steel stairs descended into pitch-black darkness. She retrieved the heavy flashlight she had brought from the cabin, and she went down alone. Silas had left this for her. She would meet him alone. The stairs ended 20 feet below the surface opening, into a massive climate-controlled chamber lined with reinforced concrete walls. Her flashlight beam swept across the space, and Cordelia gasped aloud. Along the back wall stood a row of heavy green industrial shelving units, and on those shelves sat dozens of heavy wooden crates meticulously stacked and banded with thick iron straps. In the center of the room was a simple metal desk, and on that desk lay a single leather-bound ledger, a Mont Blanc fountain pen, and a sealed envelope with a single word written on it in Silas's elegant, sweeping handwriting. Cordelia. She crossed the concrete floor slowly, her boots echoing in the vast silence. She sat down in the metal chair at the desk, and with hands that shook so violently she could barely control them, she opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated 3 years earlier. My dearest Cordelia, if you are reading this, then my mind has failed me and I am gone. I am also deeply sorry for. It means Grayson has shown his true colors and driven you to this place. For years I watched my son become a man consumed by a greed I could not comprehend. 3 years ago, I discovered he was quietly embezzling millions from Ashworth Manufacturing, siphoning the company's lifeblood into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He thought I was too old and too foolish to notice. I let him think it. I knew that if I confronted him directly, his corporate lawyers would tie the estate in litigation for decades, and you would be left destitute long before any settlement was reached. So I played the fool. I quietly liquidated my personal founder shares, our private wealth accounts at JP Morgan Chase, and every hidden asset I possessed. I converted it all into physical bullion, purchased legally through a private broker, and stored here in this vault I built beneath the land I bought 30 years ago as a tax write-off. I left Grayson the company knowing it is a hollow shell gutted by his own theft, waiting to collapse the moment federal auditors take a serious look. But the true wealth of the Ashworth legacy. Cordy, everything I wanted you to have is in this room. The deed to this barren land is your impenetrable shield. Grayson signed it away himself. He cannot touch what is here. I could not protect you while I lived without dragging you into 10 years of litigation. This was the only way. I love you, Cordelia. I have loved you for 22 years, and I will love you for whatever comes next. Now live the life you deserve. Silas. Tears streamed down Cordelia's cheeks, dropping onto the dusty concrete floor. She pressed the letter against her heart and wept silently for a long time. Silas had not abandoned her. He had planned every step. He had sacrificed his own company, his own reputation, his own dignity in Grayson's eyes to build her this shield. When she finally rose from the desk, she walked to the nearest wooden crate. She used a heavy flathead screwdriver she found in a tool bin against the wall to pry up the lid, snapping the rusted iron band. The flashlight beam reflected off a brilliant, mesmerizing yellow glow. The crate was packed tightly with row upon row of pure, solid gold bars. Each one was stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the Credit Suisse refinery. Cordelia reached down and picked one up. It was astonishingly heavy, cold to the touch, and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. It was beautiful because Silas had put it there for her. She looked around the vault. 40 crates. She counted them slowly, her flashlight beam moving from stack to stack. $60 million, perhaps more. Cordelia sank down onto the concrete floor beside the open crate, holding the gold bar against her chest, as she had held Silas's letter, and she cried until she had no tears left. Then she climbed the steel stairs, emerged into the pale April sunlight, closed the hatch, and walked to Clement Hargrove's farmhouse to ask him to come see something. Clement did not speak for a full 3 minutes after his flashlight beam illuminated the crates. He stood in the center of the vault with his weathered brown hat clutched against his chest, his gray eyes wide, his weathered face gone pale beneath its sunburn. "Good Lord, Cordelia," he finally whispered. "This is a king's ransom." "It was Silas's," she said quietly. "He built it for me." "He built it right." Clement shook his head slowly, walking along the row of shelves. "The concrete work, the ventilation, the drainage. This is engineer's work. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." "I need your help, Clement." He turned to look at her. "Not with the gold," she said quickly. "The gold stays exactly where it is. What I need is different." She led him back to the desk and picked up the leather-bound ledger. She opened it, flipping through page after page of Silas's meticulous handwriting. The ledger contained every detail, every embezzled dollar Grayson had stolen from Ashworth Manufacturing over the past 3 years, every offshore shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, every wire transfer, every dummy invoice, every corrupt account number. Silas had documented it all patiently and quietly from his study at Oak Grove, while his son believed him to be a doddering old fool. $20 million of embezzled corporate assets, documented to the penny. "Cordelia, Clement said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. This isn't just a will contest. This is federal. I know. You take this to the county sheriff, they'll bury it. Grayson has half the county on his payroll. I know that too. He looked at her for a long moment. So what do you want to do? Cordelia closed the ledger and held it against her chest. Her voice was steady and quiet and absolutely certain. I want to go to the FBI in Boston tomorrow, and I want you to drive me there in your truck because Grayson has people watching the roads by now. But I need you to understand something, Clement. This is my fight. Silas left it to me. You are helping me get there, but the walking through the door is mine. Clement Hargrove studied the 72-year-old widow standing before him in a mud-stained coat, her silver hair tangled from 3 days of digging her hands raw and bleeding. And he saw something in her that reminded him of his late wife on the last day of her life. A steel that no illness, no cruelty, no winter could break. He nodded once. I'll have the truck ready at 4 in the morning. 200 miles south in the gleaming glass tower of Ashworth Manufacturing in Burlington. Grayson Ashworth was hurling a crystal decanter of scotch against the wall of his father's former office. The glass exploded, expensive liquor raining down onto the plush carpet in a shattering cascade. What do you mean the accounts are empty? Grayson screamed. His handsome face flushed crimson, his tailored Italian suit rumpled with rage. Across the mahogany desk, a terrified forensic accountant from PricewaterhouseCoopers adjusted his tie with a trembling hand. He was a small man in his 50s named Bradford Ellison, and he had been dreading this moment for 6 hours. Mr. Ashworth, I have audited the private wealth ledgers as you requested. The capital did not vanish recently. Over the past 3 years, your father systematically liquidated over $60 million in personal assets. The funds were wired through a series of dummy corporations and then used to purchase physical gold bullion through a private broker at J.P. Morgan Chase. The transactions were legal. They were fully taxed, and they were completely removed from the corporate ecosystem before his death. Where is it? Grayson snarled, leaning across the desk. My father was a senile old fool. He did not simply burn $60 million. Where did he hide it? We do not know, sir. The only anomaly in the records is a series of large freight deliveries made to an unzoned rural property owned by the estate. Tract 42 in Oakhaven County. Grayson froze. The blood drained from his face so quickly he had to grip the edge of the desk to stay upright. Tract 42. The worthless barren wasteland he had happily signed over to his despised stepmother just to get her out of his life. Miller's Folly. 12 acres of rocks and dead earth. The property his father had bought 30 years ago as a tax write-off. Grayson stared at the wall for a long moment, and then he began to laugh. It was a high, unhinged sound. Get me my security team, he said quietly, his voice suddenly ice-cold. I want them at Tract 42 tomorrow morning, and I want them armed. Bradford Ellison practically fled from the office. At 4 in the morning, Clement Hargrove pulled up to the cabin in his old Ford pickup. Cordelia was waiting on the porch in a clean gray sweater, the leather-bound ledger wrapped in an oilcloth and clutched against her chest. She had bathed as best she could from a bucket of creek water heated on the wood stove. She had brushed her silver hair. She looked, Clement thought, like a woman going to war. They drove through the darkness in comfortable silence. For the first hour, the truck's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn fog on the winding Vermont back roads. Somewhere south of Montpelier, as the first gray light began to appear on the horizon, Cordelia began to speak. I met Silas when I was 50, she said quietly, watching the road unspool ahead of them. I was working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Rutland. He came in one afternoon to consult on a tax matter. He was 48. His first wife had died 6 months earlier, and he was raising Grayson alone. Grayson was 10 years old. Clement said nothing, letting her talk. I did not want to marry him at first. I had been alone for a long time by then, and I was set in my ways. But he was patient with me. He came back to that accounting firm every week for 3 months, asking questions he did not really need to ask just to see me. Eventually, I said yes. She smiled faintly at the memory. I tried so hard with Grayson, I really did. But some children are born with a stone where their heart should be clement, and no matter how much love you pour onto that stone, it never softens. It only stays cold. My son was not like that, Clement said quietly. His voice was rough. Michael was full of light. He worked on a logging crew in the White Mountains after high school. 15 years ago, his truck went off the road on a bad grade in a February storm. He was 23. Cordelia looked at him. I'm sorry, Clement. So am I, Cordelia. They drove on into the growing morning light. Two aging widowers with grief pressed close against their hearts, understanding each other without needing to say more. The FBI Boston field office occupied a nondescript concrete building at One Center Plaza. Cordelia had never been inside a federal building in her life. She stood in the lobby feeling small and out of place until a receptionist directed them to the white-collar crimes division on the 8th floor. Special Agent Everett Blackwood was 45 years old, tall with graying temples and sharp brown eyes. He listened to Cordelia's opening explanation with polite skepticism for exactly 90 seconds. Then she unwrapped the oilcloth and set the leather-bound ledger on his desk. He opened it. He read the first page. He read the second. He looked up at Cordelia with an entirely different expression on his face. Mrs. Ashworth, he said slowly, who else has seen this? My neighbor, Clement Hargrove, that is all. And your husband compiled this documentation himself. Every page, over 3 years. Blackwood stared at the ledger for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to his office door and called out to someone in the hallway. Within 10 minutes, 4 other agents were in the office. Within 30 minutes, Blackwood was on the phone with the federal prosecutor. Mrs. Ashworth, he said when he finally returned to her. Your husband was a genius. This is the cleanest embezzlement case I have seen in 12 years with the Bureau. We are going to move on this tonight. He explained that a federal task force would need to converge on both Ashworth Manufacturing and Tract 42 simultaneously to prevent evidence destruction. He explained that Grayson had likely already discovered the missing funds and was almost certainly attempting to recover them. And then he asked Cordelia if she would be willing to wear a recording device. He will come to Tract 42, Blackwood said quietly. Probably tomorrow morning. He knows the gold is there. If we can get him on tape confessing along with this ledger, we can secure a conviction that will hold on appeal for the next 20 years. Cordelia looked at Clement, then back at Blackwood. Put it on me, she said. They drove back through the deepening April afternoon, Clement's old truck rattling on the Vermont back roads. Cordelia sat with a small microphone taped beneath her sweater and a plan burning quietly in her chest. The sun was rising when they finally turned onto the rutted dirt track that led to Tract 42. Clement pulled the truck up beside the cabin, killed the engine, and looked at Cordelia in the growing light. He is going to come today, isn't he? Yes. Clement reached behind the seat and pulled out his double-barreled shotgun. He checked the breech, snapped it closed, and rested it across his knees. Then I will be here. Cordelia opened the truck door and climbed out into the pale morning air. She walked up to the porch of the cabin, sat down in the old wooden rocking chair. Clement had brought her back in December and folded her hands in her lap. In the distance from the direction of the county road, She heard the first low growl of heavy engines approaching. Part 3: Confrontation and Justice. The three black armored SUVs tore down the rutted gravel road, kicking up massive plumes of grey dust that hung in the pale April morning air like smoke from a battlefield. Their tinted windows caught the rising sun as they crested the small hill above Tract 42, and for a moment, they looked less like vehicles than like some kind of dark mechanical predator descending on wounded prey. Cordelia Ashworth did not move from her rocking chair on the porch. She sat with her weathered hands folded in her lap, a chipped ceramic teacup steaming quietly on the wooden railing beside her, her silver hair pulled back in a simple knot. Beneath her gray sweater, the small microphone special agent Everett Blackwood had taped to her collarbone the previous evening, pressed lightly against her skin, a quiet witness to whatever was about to happen. Clement Hargrove stood a few feet to her right, his double-barreled shotgun resting casually across his forearm, his weathered brown hat pulled low over his gray eyes. He said nothing. He did not need to. The three SUVs skidded to a violent halt in the muddy clearing just yards from the cabin. The doors flew open, and 6 burly private security contractors stepped out in tactical black gear, their hands resting menacingly on the belts at their waists, where heavy stun batons hung. They spread out in a loose semicircle, professionally trained, cold-eyed, and completely unprepared for the 70-year-old man with a shotgun who watched them come. Finally, the door of the lead SUV opened, and Grayson Ashworth stepped out onto the muddy ground of Tract 42 for the first time in his life. His custom Italian suit was rumpled, his tie loose, his handsome young face pale with a manic, sleepless frenzy. His polished shoes sank immediately into the wet earth, and he looked down at them with the flicker of disgust, before his eyes rose to find Cordelia on the porch. When he saw her sitting there so calmly, so unafraid, something in his expression shifted from calculation to pure rage. He took one look at the heavy steel hatch protruding from the dirt behind the cabin, which Cordelia had deliberately left partially uncovered, and he let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. "You old witch!" Grayson spat, marching toward the porch through the mud. "You found it! You actually found my money!" "It is not your money, Grayson," Cordelia said, taking a slow sip of her tea. Her voice was remarkably calm, carrying across the cold wind. "Your father left me the deed to this land and everything upon it and beneath it. You made absolutely sure that the will was ironclad. Remember, your lawyers guaranteed it." Grayson's face twisted into a snarl. "Do you think I care about a piece of paper that gold was bought with Ashworth manufacturing assets that belong to me? You manipulated a dying senile man into hiding my inheritance." "He hid it," Cordelia corrected gently, "because he knew you were stealing from the company. He knew you were embezzling, Grayson. Every dollar, every offshore account, every wire transfer to Grand Cayman. He wrote it all down." Grayson paused. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his eyes, quickly buried beneath his rage. "You're bluffing." "I am not." He was drooling in his oatmeal for the last 2 years of his life. He couldn't remember his own name. There's no way he documented anything. "Would you like me to tell you the account numbers?" Cordelia asked quietly. She recited 3 of them from memory slowly and clearly. She had studied the ledger for hours in the FBI office in Boston, memorizing details Blackwood had told her might be useful. "The one in Georgetown you opened in the name of Meridian Holdings, LLC. The one you routed through a shell company in Nevis before it landed in your personal account. The third one is more interesting. That one shares a signatory with your attorney, Ezekiel Thorne." Grayson went very still. The color drained from his face. Behind him, one of his security contractors shifted uncomfortably. "You don't know anything," Grayson said. but his voice had lost some of its edge. I know that when your father figured out what you were doing, he did not confront you. Cordelia continued, still holding her teacup between her hands as though this were an ordinary conversation. He knew that if he did, you would drag the estate into court for a decade, and I would starve before any of it was resolved. So he sold everything quietly over 3 years, his founder shares, his JP Morgan accounts, his personal investments. He converted it all into gold and buried it under a piece of land you laughed at. He left you a company he knew was already dying from the inside because of you. Shut up, Grayson said. He gave me a shield, Cordelia said. A deed to a worthless field signed and witnessed and airtight, so that when you finally realized what you had done, you could not touch me. Shut up, Grayson screamed. He waved a dismissive, trembling hand at his security team. It doesn't matter what you found. You're an old, frail woman sitting in the middle of nowhere. My men are going down into that bunker, and we are taking every single crate. If you or this dirt farming neighbor of yours try to stop us, things will get very unfortunate for you. You are trespassing on private property, boy. Clement Hargrove warned, quietly racking the shotgun with a loud, deliberate clack that cut through the morning air. Grayson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Shoot me, old man. See what happens to you and this witch in the next 24 hours. Boys, get into the vault. Secure the gold. The security contractors moved forward, unholstering their stun batons. Cordelia did not flinch. She simply set her teacup down on the rotting wooden railing and stood up slowly, using the arm of the rocking chair for balance. Then she walked to the top of the porch steps and looked down at Grayson from perhaps 6 feet of elevation, her face suddenly hard as granite. Before your men take another step, she said, her voice carrying, I want you to say it to my face. I want you to admit what you did. What? You embezzled from Ashworth Manufacturing. You stole from your own father. You paid Ezekiel Thorne to alter that will, while your father was too senile to defend himself. You threw me into the rain with 3 garbage bags and laughed while I bled on the driveway. Look me in the eye and say it. Grayson stared up at her. His manic rage was so complete now that reason had left him entirely. He wanted to hurt her. He wanted to break her the way he believed she had somehow broken him. And there in the mud of Miller's Folly, with his private army spread out behind him, and no camera he could see anywhere in sight, he thought he could afford to. Fine, he snarled. Yes, I took $20 million from that company. It was my company. My father was too weak to run it, and I built it into what it is today. Every dollar I took, I earned. Yes, I paid Thorne to rewrite the will. Yes, I threw you out. You were nothing. You were a leech. And that gold in the vault was bought with money that belonged to Ashworth Manufacturing, which means it belonged to me. So spare me your sanctimonious lecture, you dried-up old widow, and get out of my way before you get hurt. Cordelia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him over his shoulder toward the tree line to the east. Thank you, Grayson, she said quietly. That was all I needed. At the exact moment the words left her lips, the sound came. The distinct rhythmic chopping of heavy rotor blades echoed across the barren field, low and fast, coming in over the trees. Grayson jerked his head up, squinting against the morning sun. Cresting the tree line to the east were 2 dark helicopters moving in tight formation, moving fast. At the same moment, the sound of wailing sirens erupted from the main road, and a fleet of unmarked black federal sedans and Oakhaven County sheriff's cruisers came barreling down the dirt paths, effectively blocking Grayson's SUVs from any retreat. Dust swirled furiously as the vehicles slammed on their brakes. Dozens of armed federal agents in FBI emblazoned jackets swarmed out, weapons raised. A commanding voice boomed through a bullhorn. "Federal agents, drop your weapons, hands in the air." Grayson's security team, realizing instantly that they were outmatched and outgunned by the federal government of the United States, dropped their stun batons and raised their hands without a single word of protest. Two of them looked at their employer with expressions that made clear their loyalty ended exactly at the point where federal prison began. Grayson stood frozen in absolute disbelief as Special Agent Everett Blackwood marched up to him through the mud, accompanied by a very pale-looking Ezekiel Thorne, whose hands were already cuffed behind his back. A second team of agents had swept into Thorne's private office in Burlington, at the same moment seizing his files and arresting him at his desk. "Grayson Ashworth!" Blackwood barked, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud, and everything else we can think of by the end of the week. You have the right to remain silent." "You can't do this!" Grayson screamed, his voice cracking with panic as the agent violently wrenched his arms behind his back and secured the cuffs. "She stole my money. That gold belongs to me. Look in the vault." "We already know about the vault, Mr. Ashworth," Blackwood replied coldly, unclipping a small recorder from his belt and holding it up so Grayson could see it. "Mrs. Ashworth's neighbor drove her to my office in Boston yesterday. We have reviewed her sworn statement, her husband's ledger, and the photographic evidence of the vault. And we have your voice from the last 4 minutes on federal recording equipment confessing to every count I just charged you with. As for the gold, your father purchased it legally using his own liquidated post-tax founder shares through a private broker at J.P. Morgan Chase. He deeded the land to Mrs. Ashworth, making her the sole undisputed legal owner of everything on and beneath that property. You signed that deed transfer yourself." Grayson's knees buckled. The absolute reality of his destruction crashed down on him at once. He had signed away his own salvation. In his greed to secure the corporate empire and evict his stepmother from his life, he had legally cemented her ownership of a $60 million fortune while leaving himself holding a hollowed-out company that would now be seized by federal auditors, sold for scrap, and used to compensate the workers, vendors, and pension holders he had spent 3 years quietly robbing. He looked up at Cordelia on the porch, and for one strange moment the manic rage drained from his face, and he was suddenly the 10-year-old boy she had first met in a small accounting office in Heartland 22 years earlier. The little boy who had lost his mother and looked at her with weary, wounded eyes. "Cordelia," Grayson choked out. He was sobbing now, thrashing weakly against the cuffs. "Cordelia, please. I'm your son. You raised me. Don't let them do this." Cordelia stood up straight at the top of the porch steps. She walked slowly down the rotting wooden stairs, one weathered hand on the railing for balance. She walked across the muddy ground until she was standing just 3 feet from Grayson, close enough to see the tears on his face, close enough that he could look up into her eyes and find no mercy there. "You threw me out into the freezing rain with garbage bags, Grayson," she said. Her voice was soft, but it echoed across the barren field with absolute authority. "You laughed while I shivered on the pavement. You raised a glass of whiskey to me through the window. I loved your father, and I tried to love you. I tried for 22 years, but you chose your path. You chose it every single day from the moment you first understood what greed was. Now the ride is over." She turned her back on him. She did not look back as the FBI agents shoved a sobbing, thrashing Grayson into the back of a federal cruiser and slammed the heavy door shut, sealing his fate forever. She walked back to Clement Hargrove and reached out to steady herself on his arm. Only then did she allow herself to shake. The next 6 months passed in a controlled, deliberate storm. Ashworth Manufacturing was seized by federal auditors within 72 hours of Grayson's arrest. Bradford Ellison, the terrified PricewaterhouseCoopers accountant, cooperated fully with prosecutors in exchange for immunity, providing them with a complete forensic accounting of every dollar Grayson had siphoned into his offshore accounts. The company was sold in pieces to pay off the massive debts Grayson had incurred and to compensate the pension fund of the loyal workers who had spent decades building it. The Burlington Glass Tower, where Grayson had once lounged in his father's leather chair, was purchased by a regional bank and repainted in shades of dark blue. Ezekiel Thorne, the family attorney who had helped rewrite Silas's will during his final weeks of confusion, was disbarred, convicted of conspiracy and fraud, and sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. His name was struck from the rolls of the Vermont Bar Association, and his 6 decades of legal work were quietly transferred to other attorneys who had never heard of him. He served his sentence quietly and was released as an old man with nothing. Grayson Ashworth was tried in federal court in Burlington the following October, almost exactly 1 year to the day after his father's funeral. The prosecutor's case built on Silas's meticulous ledger, and the recording of Grayson's confession at Tract 42 was so overwhelming that his defense attorneys advised him to plead. He refused, insisting on a trial. He was convicted on all counts. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, who had listened for weeks to testimony about the pensioners Grayson had robbed, and the 72-year-old widow he had thrown into the rain, sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. Cordelia attended every day of the trial. She sat in the first row behind the prosecution, wearing a simple black wool coat. Her silver hair pulled back, her weathered hands folded in her lap. She did not smile when the verdict was read. She simply closed her eyes and, in the quiet of her own heart, said her husband's name. On the morning after the verdict, she walked into the courtyard. The court order. She moved slowly through the rooms.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road.
She sat down,
never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow.
and spoke to him.
The eagle learns within the wind.
I am home, Silas. You won. In the weeks that followed, Cordelia contacted Sussex's private
walk where
and quietly
paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy. The storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me. They were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey. Every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason for the climb.
She hired Rosalind Van Silas, former secretary of 20 years, to serve as executive director. Rosalind had come to Coaching.
I've known loss that left me broken. I've known fear that stole my breath. I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher. Every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another
dead cedar tree
The mountain is not in my
on a
way.
warm summer
The mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking why me and started asking what can I learn. The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to
Folks in
burn.
the
For
farm
every challenge holds a gift.
They think you're
Though hidden from the eye, the obstacle and destination
touch the heavy silver locket
will never separate all
the steel
this
key
time.
that had once been
The road was never meant to be easy. The storm was never meant to end. The battles were not sent to break me. They were sent to shape the man I am. Every trial is part of the journey. Every loss becomes a light. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason I can rise. So when the thunder finds me again, and dark clouds gather in the sky, I'll greet them like old companions, because they belong
barren to
to
either of them.
the journey.
Behind them in the quiet Vermont afternoon, the shadow of the dead cedar tree stretched long that had kept its secret for 30 years and had finally given it at long last to the only person who had ever deserved it.